remember some of this from year 10, but we'll be revisiting it in a bit more depth this time around and introducing some key terms. So to understand biodiversity, I first need to classify what an ecosystem actually is. You've probably heard that term thrown around a lot, but we need an actual definition to hold on to in this case. It's more than just a collection of living things. It's dynamic, and it's a biological community where living and non-living factors interact and influence each other. That's really the key thing to note. It's extremely dynamic and evolving, and that's because of all these interactions that occur within them. We call these living things, so the living things that interact, biotic factors, and the ones that don't live or are non-living, abiotic factors. You're going to hear me use those terms quite a bit, so it's a good thing to keep in mind. Biotic, living, abiotic, non-living. We'll start by taking a look at the first one, biotic factors. So biotic factors are the living organisms that directly affect the ecosystems they inhabit. So you can think things like animals, plants, bacteria, and fungi. You're probably used to seeing living things, or at least have a vague idea of what is living and what is not. These organisms actually engage in interactions. We have specific terms for these interactions, and you might know a couple off the top of your head. There's predation, parasitism, competition, etc. We'll actually get to explore a couple of those later in the lesson. But you can imagine that if a lion predates a gazelle, the population of gazelle will decrease. So that interaction is actually affecting the ecosystem as a whole. It's affecting the gazelle numbers, and it's affecting how we define that ecosystem. And because of that, we can say that biotic factors influence ecosystems. It's very similar for our second one here, abiotic factors. These are the non-living and physical chemical elements that impact ecosystems. So you can think basically everything that isn't living will generally be an abiotic factor. Things like water, soil, salinity, temperature, and rainfall. These factors aren't actually alive, so it might be a little more difficult to see their role compared to living things, but they're equally, if not more important than living factors, or biotic factors, sorry. So basically they influence the growth, reproduction, and survival of organisms in a lot of different ways. So for instance, temperature and rainfall can determine when species thrive in a particular environment, and soil composition can affect plant growth, which in turn impacts herbivores and the predators that rely on them. So really these, they have more umbrella effects. They stem off, if one thing impacts something, then it will continually impact other things when it's the case for biotic factors. Since these factors affect living organisms that make up an ecosystem, they are in turn affecting the biotic factors that make up that ecosystem. And because of that, they are affecting the ecosystem, which is why that we say that an ecosystem is a biological community that is affected by abiotic and biotic factors. So hopefully you're beginning to see how non-living and living things are really intertwined in an ecosystem. And on top of that, how endlessly complex ecosystems really are. It's a pretty oversight to just say that it's a bunch of organisms living together, because there's so many interactions that occur within them. What makes them even more complex is the fact that these interactions have a range of effects. Some of them are beneficial, some are harmful, and some are neutral. And you might be able to just think off the top of your head what might be a harmful, neutral, beneficial interaction. You can imagine that if a shark and a fish are living together, the fish is feeding off the debris from the shark. This would be a beneficial relationship because both are thriving. A relationship where water is sparse and that leads to the death of nearby plants would be harmful for the ecosystem. And these all add up together to make an ecosystem really an ecosystem. So they're all important. Okay, so now that we know what an ecosystem is, we can begin to look and compare different ecosystems. We usually do this by looking at them on a spatial and temporal scale. So I'll take a look at the spatial scale first, or the spatial scale. So as the name suggests, this is really just the physical size of an ecosystem. Ecosystems, as you might expect, can range a lot in size. They can be massive or really small. For example, small areas like specific forests, mountains, and even like paddocks that you see at farms can be classified as an ecosystem, but you can keep going and getting bigger. These paddocks are a part of a medium-scale ecosystem, such as a mountain range or a desert. And then this just keeps expanding. You get large scales like entire continents and oceans. So separating ecosystems by size really helps us to understand how they function at different levels. What's happening in the middle of Australia, in the arid desert, for example, is very, very different from what's happening in the cities, for example. They're still technically a part of the same ecosystem, but they're made up of other ecosystems. So there are a lot of layers to it, and that's why it's important to separate by spatial scale. But the second way we can compare ecosystems is by looking on a temporal scale. And a temporal scale basically considers an ecosystem over time instead of in terms of size. So just like spatial scales, temporal scales can vary from very short-term processes that happen within hours or days to medium-term things like seasonal changes. You can observe how an ecosystem might change with the season, and all the way to long-term shifts that occur over years. As you can imagine, the place that you're sitting and watching this from now is completely different to how it was 100 years ago. Even 10 years ago or a year ago, it's different. It's constantly evolving. And that's what makes ecosystems viewable from a temporal scale. They're always evolving and always changing. So from this concept, we can actually arrive at a really different or key idea within temporal scales, which is known as ecological succession. I know that sounds a little weird, but this is just really the process by which the structure of a biological community or ecosystem evolves over time. It's really just the word we use to describe this evolution that an ecosystem undergoes. And this can involve the gradual displacement of one species by another. It can involve the entire recovery of an ecosystem through changes in species after things like fires and natural disasters. And ecological succession is just really the way that basically the process by which this change that we observe on a temporal scale evolves or occurs through things like change in species. So it can, if you take anything from this slide, I would really like it to be that, ecological succession. It's a really key idea, and it also sometimes appears on the externals. All it really is just the process by which species and a habitat in an area changes over time. Okay, so hopefully you're able to recognize what ecological succession is now. We're going to move on to the next one.